MIT and Stanford for making this possible at rather short notice. I think it's the spirit that counts, and hopefully we will not only succeed tonight to revive our friendship with Bucky, but of course those of us going to meet on the Champuan meetings over the next day and a half will take that further. Before I met Bucky, I was, I suppose, a conventional architect, like many people graduating from schools of architecture. And I feel fortunate to have known him in the last 12 years of his life. That seems a very short period, and certainly a much shorter period than many of you who knew him. So in a sense, I might be a new boy to the club, although there are newer boys, and I'm sure Bucky wanted to encourage newer boys to this club of thinking about the world. He was a great friend, and I don't regard myself either as an associate or a student or even an acolyte, because one of the tests of friendship is to forgive me for my lapses in understanding him. For example, one of his favorite tests for architects is to ask them, what is the weight of your building? And as you know, he made a great thing about lightness in building as a virtue we should aspire to in economy. I think that's a word that was missing so far from the discussion. And I thought as the last speaker, all I had to do was to fill in the cracks, so I'll try my best to do that. The question of doing more with less was a very fundamental thought, which I think is an inspiration which should be remembered and repeated. So anyway, he forgave me and never asked me that question, how much does your building weigh? And he would inflict this, I think, I probably did it the first time when he came to MIT. In Singapore, he used to live with me in a house which, strangely enough, was the exact dimension of the Dimexin house. It was hexagonal. And of course, when I made it, I actually knew very little about Bucky, and I wasn't thinking of Bucky. But a kind of cosmic coincidence has it that house is of the same dimension. He used to stay there, and he never asked me how much that building weighed, because he knew I didn't know. He also forgave me for not really understanding all the intricacies of his geometry, although he saw that I had a curiosity in the visual impact of some of his diagrams and so on. And the interesting thing about the two books, I think it was Arthur Clarke who wrote a thing for the blurb on the cover called Bucky the Buddha of geometry. Now that has a rather interesting significance, and of course Arthur, living in Sri Lanka, probably had it back of his mind. And the essence of Buddhism is that you're not going to get there in one lifetime. So you have many more lifetimes to live. And it's an intriguing idea to wonder what other lifetimes Bucky might be inhabiting right now. And Francois will remember when we were in Boulder, there were kind of extrasensory indications that he was around. And I think when Bucky died, he did pass a thought on to people close to him that he was going to try to reach us from out there. Rather interesting idea. Maybe he is around, and it's for us to interpret. Anyway, the voyage of discovery went beyond domes, although I had the opportunity of working on a few domes with him. For our Champuan meetings, I found myself learning about tensegrity domes in bamboo and finding out experientially what were the limits of bamboo, which I think is still very romantic material to some people, but we made a bamboo dome largely for the second Champuan meeting, which became the site for his birthday. A great event, which all those who went there I think will never forget. I then made a whole series of useful botanical domes, which also became bird domes. Bucky was always talking about a grown dome, so these domes are rather nice. It was a 32-footer, and we could grow things on them, and they are being used in Malaysia as aviaries and so on. Then with Shoji, we made the big dome in Komtar, which is the urban center in Penang, which is a 144-footer, with the help of Temcor. And perhaps this might well be Bucky's last dome. And he saw it before it was constructed, and we celebrated it after Bucky died in '86, when we opened it and had a big exhibition the first playing of the World Game there. I subsequently made another dome in memory of Bucky in Bangkok, which was the botanical pavilion contributed by the US citizens and merchants in Bangkok. They, strangely enough, transcended national boundaries and called me in Malaysia whether I would recommend a building for the King's Park. And I said a geodesic, and they accepted it. The problems then wasn't so much with the US community, it was with the Thai embassy and the Thai authorities, because they would not allow a foreign architect to work in Thailand. So anyway, it was good that we could rope in Sumet Jumsai, another great friend of Bucky's. And Sumet fronted for this and actually did quite a bit of work himself. So if you go to Bangkok, you'll see this dome, which I think is a nice memory, because Bucky has always felt that Bangkok was a centroid in that particular triangle in this Dymaxion map of the world, centroid of Southeast Asia. So there it is, and it is certainly a nice situation. We actually put the big map in the floor, and also other Dymaxion symbols to remember him. So these were kind of practical encounters. But more and more, I became concerned about the humanism of Bucky. And although I was not a very good reader of his writings and his poems, they're not easy to read, I enjoyed their titles more than their content. I mean, the great works like "And It Came to Pass But Not to Stay" became a rather nice catchphrase for our Champuan meeting. Champuan being confluence, coming together, but it goes on. You just can't sort of stratify life and thought. It goes on. The other great work he wrote, of course, a great title rather, was "No More Second-Hand God." It actually conveys a completely different thing from what I think the title would mean to a lot of people, or as it meant to me. And I must well tell you another anecdote. I happened to be at the great event in St. John the Divine, and I think Shoji will remember this because he's going to be involved in an event at St. John in November. I was privy to this because I was hanging around. Bucky always said, "Follow me," and I went, and he was having a briefing from Dean Morton, who was telling him how to behave. First he had to be dressed like a cardinal. And I went in, and subsequently, I think my photograph of Bucky was the only authentic one. Nobody was thinking of taking photos, but I was one of these foreigners who didn't know the rules. I shot him there. And they subsequently brought Bucky back to be photographed, stage set and all. Anyway, Dean Morton began his introduction by asking, "Bucky, in your poem, No More Second-Hand God, you said, quote, 'Surely you meant that.'" And he was trying to fit Bucky into the orthodoxy of the Episcopalian thinking. And he began to interpret Bucky. Anyway, Bucky was training on his hearing aid and turned around and said, "No, John, that wasn't what I meant. What I meant was," and he went on for 45 minutes. He just could not be stopped. Well, that poem requires a lot of reading and rereading. And I am minded, as a friend, I think he would have permitted me to reinterpret it. Because one uncomfortable part of that poem really refers to the God of machines, the God inherent in machines. He was trying to sanctify machinery. And I hope one day YC will write this into his study of theology in Bucky. And it might give rise to the interpretation that he was a technocrat. But he was so enthusiastic about the significance of the higher spirits and machine that was really the God he meant. But to me, the title itself was really tremendous because it will lead me to a quotation I'm going to give you slightly later on. Anyway, the other little experience I had with him was over the 10 synergetic posters which he showed us in Champuan in 1977. And I remember, amongst other people, Niva, one of the friends who went, complaining how expensive it was, these posters, which are now tremendous collector's items. So I said to Bucky innocently, why don't we print it in a format which was more economical? Anyway, that's what led me to publish this with him, Synergetics Folio, which will be a collector's item. And I've just given one to Roche Library, which apparently didn't have it. I checked through the bibliography. And I think if we check through bibliography, check through the use of bibliography, we'll know how much people are really remembering Bucky or trying to understand him, because he's not easy to capsulize. And when we think also of his concept of ethics, it's not easy to define the limits of his thinking. In fact, he will go on beyond his lifetime into new lifetimes. Anyway, this was an experience for me because apart from the tremendous posters within the folio, look at this, the cosmic hierarchy. This is in Synergetics 2 in a rather inferior format. But here you have this, which we did as a visual aid. It can open right up. And maybe, YC, would you like to just do that? Anyway, there's some tremendous things in here because if you looked at it closely, you can see all the analogs with the universe that Bucky was trying to characterize, and even the whole concept of whether matter could be created. And he showed topologically that it could be done. So solving some mysteries of the universe. The interesting part to me, however, was the preamble essay, which he called Humans in Universe, which is at the beginning of that folio. And to everybody's surprise, I think Shirley most of all, I had the audacity to say to Bucky, I think the title is slightly too pretentious and people won't understand Humans in Universe. So he allowed me to coin the subtitle, which is actually called From Selfishness to Synergetics and Sufficiency. And this links really to his concept of the world for you and me, and the idea that there is, in fact, the ethos of sharing. Now, this is an idea I want to develop in some of my own writing on Bucky. So the question of sharing the world and the intellectual preparedness to do this, therefore the mental revolution, I think underlies what Bucky has signaled to us. Within the preamble, he quotes, strangely enough, a very colonial poet, Rudyard Kipling, and characterize the divisiveness. Of course, the question of East and West shall never meet until. Now, that's the part you have to read. So it does require effort. It's not going to be an automatic bringing together of the diverse parts of the world. Many things have to happen. There, in fact, has to be a mental revolution. But perhaps it's not a revolution to be inflicted by political edict, but a revolution to be arrived at by self-choice. I think I should not take too much of your time, and I will read another very fine legacy which Bucky left us in Penang, which is his great poem, his great piece rather, on integrity. This is one of the last things he wrote and left us in the Champuan meeting in 1983, and I had the experience of actually being with him until about 10 days before he died, and we were meeting in London. Bucky was so well, and it was so strange to us that I can tell you he enjoyed his days in London 10 years before he died. We had great French meals with Cedric Price in Les Trois restaurant. We went to see Peter Ustinov backstage, and so it was quite a surprise when I was in Milan, when I read the paper that Bucky had died. I thought at first it was Mrs. Fuller, because Anne was already in a coma. And Bucky in London felt very guilty that he wasn't with Anne. And it was funny, it was in the Marco Polo Hotel in Milan when I read about it. And I walked aimlessly and found myself in the Santa Maria delle Grazie, the Last Supper, and looking at the exhibition of Leonardo there, and I looked through many of the Leonardo artifacts, and we definitely had that pre-echo of Bucky there. So it's a very strange happening. Anyway, here is Bucky's little piece. Human integrity is the uncompromising courage of self-determining whether or not to take initiatives, support or cooperate with others in accord with all the truth and nothing but the truth, as it is conceived by the divine mind, always available in each individual. Whether humanity is to continue and comprehensively prosper on spaceship Earth depends entirely on the integrity of the human individuals and not on the political and economic systems. The cosmic question has been asked, are humans a worthwhile to universe invention? Signed Bucky Fuller on February the 14th, 1983 in Penang. Well, I think that is a tremendous legacy and a tremendous encouragement to really operate in integrity and in truth. And those were the final things he was seeking, like Buddha, like a lot of other people, and hopefully there are little Buddhas in all of us and little Buckys in all of us. I will end, if I may, by getting Bucky to talk to us.
Very faulty. You're on now. Yes. I'm going to say that wrong. I'm going to start in with the ethics. Ethics is a piece that I wrote at the time of Watergate, when the news of Watergate first came out. I found in my personal life, I never tried to suppress spontaneous sensings of feeling. If I feel angry, I'm sentimental, I don't know if I feel angry, but I'm scared under control of everybody. I do not try to say to myself that this female doesn't make me feel. I like to procreate with the female, at least have sex with them. I immediately get down. I never try to suppress. I think it's very important to let whatever we consist of be operative. If you don't let it run you. So I found when Watergate occurred, I was shocked and astonished by the whole behavior. So it really, it's been implicit in politics and big money. But then I found myself writing a negative poem about it. And I said, that must not be, I must not be negative. I must write something positive. So I wrote the following and published it in the Saturday Review, and it had very high popular reception, and they liked it, particularly from the young people. And it's called Ethics. I wrote this in my usual form of what I call mental mouthfuls and ventilated prose, and it looks and so feels like poetry. Ethics. In the evolution of political economics of the late 20th century, there is an emerging pattern in which yesterday's virtues become today's vices, and vice versa, vices virtues. We hope this signals the demise of either dollar or gun manipulated political puppetries or government of humanity. Throughout the past state of innate ignorance of the many, the informed few told the uninformed many what to do, so that the many's coordinated efforts could produce most effectively the objectives of the few. And only well-informed humanity does not need to be told what needs to be done, nor how to cooperate synergetically. It does so spontaneously. Controlling the sources of production and distribution, the self-advantaging power systems keep the conflict divided by the uncontestable fiat that the individual's right to live must be earned to the power structure's satisfaction. By performing one of the ruling systems myriad of specialized functions. Top-down self-serving power structures also claims outright ownership of the lives of all those born within their sovereignly claimed geographical bounds, and can forfeit their citizens' lives in their official warfare, which is psychological necessity, is always raised in terms of moral rectitude, while covertly protecting and fostering their special self-interest. History demonstrates without exception that successful sovereign power seizes and successfully self-perpetuating supreme physical power holders in general will always attempt to divide the opposition in order to conquer them, and thereafter keep the conquered divided, to keep them conquered. To keep the conquered controlled and disintegrated and fiercely dependent, they also foster perpetuation or increase of religious, ethnic, linguistic, and skin color differentiation as obvious conditioned reflex exploitability. Special interest sovereignty will always attempt to monopolize and control all strategic information intelligence, thus to keep the divided, specializing world innocently controlled by its propaganda and dependent exclusively upon its dictates. Youth has discovered all this and is countering with comprehensivity and synergy. Youth will win all grounding, but truth is eternally regenerative in youth. Youth's love embracingly integrates, successfully frustrates, and holds together, often unwittingly, all the hate, fear, and selfishness attempt to disintegrate. Now, if you go on, last spring of 1974 in America.
This is a poem by Bucky, which I think has not been published.
We have a very severe winter, and there's the beauty of the spring coming.
Very short.
But the spring and the summer, I like the tropical everyday life. And in late May, we have the beginnings of little feeling that lovely time is coming, the soft, warm days. And I was writing in my apartment in Philadelphia up on the 31st floor, with the windows open. It was the 30th of May, and suddenly the lovely soft winds are coming through. 2 o'clock in the morning, I went to a long ago on the bed, and I was writing about economics and politics. And suddenly, completely foreign to what I was writing about, thoughts came to me, and I've learned when thoughts come to you, you must write them down. I wrote it down rapidly. I never had any poetry come to me quite so swiftly and so well organized. For several of these hours, deep inside me from the many springs, and here's what I found. So writing that why yours truly. I'm not yours. You're not mine. My years of life are 79. Mystery is deep. I opine, curvaceous, silkaceous you. I'm nigh inefficacious. What may we do? I can't eat you and have you too. Let's enjoy laughter and wisdom too. You're eternally lovely, the truly you. You can't see me. I can't see you. But we may know one another, and sometimes do. Then learn that we both love only all that's true. Therefore, we both love the truly you. I love you forever, the truly you.
I was
familiar with his work. My interest in his work happened quite a bit later. I was very discouraged while I was attending architecture school at University of Pennsylvania. I was very much interested in some of what Louis Kahn was doing there at the time and the Philadelphia School. But then I determined after study that basically what was being taught was decoration and sculpturing of light and space, but not what I was intrigued with in architecture, which was how everything was structured. I guess my interest in Bucky actually came from a very different direction. I found that his map was the only map I could use in my research. And I was doing research that was similar to some of Feng Shui, which was discussed earlier. I was plotting ley lines and dragging trails and things like that. But you could not do that on a map that was distorted. And you could do that in long distances on that map. And it was through that I began reading Synergetics and found that that was perhaps the first book on architecture I'd ever come in contact with, and also that Bucky Fuller was the first architect I'd ever come in contact with.
Buckminster was taught by spending a weekend at a seminar that was held, I think at Harvard, called Being the Bucky about 20 years ago. And I think probably the thing I carry away from that most is his idea that one should look for something that needs doing that no one else is doing and try to do that. And at some point you find other people are now starting to do it. Sort of drop that and look for something else that no one else has discovered yet. And I tried to carry that with me. But even though that's certainly enough, and there are many more riches to be found in his work, I'm always looking for more. And so recently I've looked through some of the Synergetics work and had a little trouble delving into it or finding maybe the key to it. I just wondered, is there sort of an easy explanation of what the significance of all that might be? I had sort of a little kernel of thought just today in this afternoon's work that somehow there may be a relationship between his idea that everything really should come out in whole numbers, and maybe that's really sort of analogous to the way things are going digital rather than analog these days. But I guess I'd just ask anyone to give a comment.
Any comments?
Well, I have a comment.
Yeah?
The idea of synergy we took because we have a number of people in the world who, as I said before, claim to be world citizens, but we have no constitution. And I went to Stafford Beer, who was the president of the World Association of General Systems and Cybernetics, and asked him, I said, you're a scientific organizer, and we have a model world government, and we need a constitution. How do we do it? And he said, well, Bucky Fuller has an incredible design, the icosahedron, or not he, but he developed this idea of synergy, and we're going to take it, and I've been experimenting with having meetings based upon the icosahedron, and in the 30 vertices we put 30 people, and then we ask one question, and the reverberation of these 30 people, and it's a 3-day meeting, develops an incredible amount of synergy and consciousness raising and so forth. He says, this might be a way for you to have like a world town meeting and whatever question you want. And we said, well, we have a question. We have a very important question, which is how can we as sovereign world citizens govern our world? That we are the governors, and that was a theme which Stafford Beer wrote about in his book, Platform for Change. And we have developed this project, and he developed the word syntegrity. In other words, synergy and integrity meet in the icosahedron in this meeting, and we've launched it. We've had 10 meetings or 11 meetings throughout the world with 30 people each, just talking about this question or addressing this question: how can we as sovereign world citizens govern our world? And it's incredible what happens. The 3-day meeting generates 12 statements which are relevant to this question of world governorship. And the statements become collated, and then we collate them and we send them around to people all over the world. And what Stafford was talking about was not just having this icosahedron on a local level, that is, we call them infosets, but on the global level using the internet. Here is a tool which is global already, and people surfing it, and it's developing by leaps and bounds, which allows for the first time people sitting at their computer to log in and address questions. Now, the software hasn't been developed yet to have a global set, we call it, but that's coming. I mean, a lot of people are very interested in developing that software. And I think that's a perfect application of Bucky's design science applied to re-empowering people. As we heard on the thing, he's talking about people and sharing. I mean, we have to re-empower ourselves on the level where our problems are, which are global today, and this is a way to do it. So it's a perfect liaison, in my view, of the application of design science to a new kind of politics, which is not divisive but is holistic.
Could I know you didn't address the question to me, but I'm going to answer it anyway in some way. This business of the whole numbers is related to the fact that, as Fuller said, lengths or distances and areas and volumes are separate things. They are separate as charges and distances are. And we have never dealt with volumes that way. If we take a very different approach, a design science approach, it turns out that we short circuit all these square root of 2's and square root of 3's that occur in our traditional calculations, and things do indeed come up in whole numbers. Now, I was somewhat disturbed by the fact that in the icosahedral pentagonal dodecahedral system with a fivefold symmetry, the golden fraction plays such a role, which is an irrational number which Buckminster Fuller despised. It went with this sense of discreteness, a discrete world versus a continuous world. And if you deny continuity, you deny irrational numbers. Then I was very cheered when I realized, I won't say discovered because it must have been discovered before, that the golden fraction is actually the tangent of half the angle whose tangent is 2. And that relates the golden fraction to the number 2, and you can construct it geometrically. So there again, the intuition was there. The whole numbers do indeed occur very much, and it's very significant. I should also say the first time Buckminster Fuller and I met was when WGBH made a television film in the 60s. And my tetrahedron octahedra that I referred to were to be featured in that. Unfortunately, they asked me what they meant. They weren't just decoration. And at that point, they took us for lunch right down the river here at the Smith House, which doesn't exist anymore. And I asked Buckminster, do you know what volume fraction of a parallelepiped is occupied by an inscribed tetrahedron? And he said, yes, 1/3, and you're the only other person I've ever met who knew that. Well, by now, a lot of people know it. So there is definitely a significance, and his intuition was always very sharp. Yeah. Yes?
I'd like to make a few comments and a few questions. Right after World War II, there was a book, Albert Einstein, Philosopher Scientist. Remember the first one we saw in the library in the late 40s? And Hallman has an article in that. So I looked up who he was when I was young. And he was editing the others, and how he was the greatest woman mathematician of all time. Because all the others were put down probably by men. And Albert Einstein's math teacher. And I urge people to look at that article. It's a book called Albert Einstein, Philosopher, Scientist, Chelsea, I think, in 48 or so. But what you just said, though, is somewhat accurate in that what people like myself are discovering now, and lots of other people, is that when you have a quantum system, you're in fractional dimensions, and it just happens. And even famous mathematicians like Gelfand and Yavlon have proven this very rigorously back 25 years ago, which is buried in the literature. So discrete sounds nice, but you have to fill in the spaces between it, and that's the function of the concept of the quantum. Just about 30 people have arrived at this in the last 5 years. And now to the things I've prepared. Number one, someone mentioned there's no dimension zero. I urge people to read Menger's book I've never found in English, and you could probably read it well. It's Dimension Theory, 1928, Teubner. But there's a 1948 version by Hurwitz and Wallman, where they have a chapter on dimension zero. And I'd be interested. It's not simple, but it's not hard. Secondly, you mentioned someone mentioned a posteriori versus a priori thinking. And the strange thing I do, because I do a kind of synergetics, my own kind of Herman Hopkins, why not do both together at once? Top down, bottom up, all at once. It's called fuzzy logic or rough sets. It works beautifully. It sounds mishuggah to use a particular expression. Some of us know it works, and no one knows why. There's an article in the AI Expert this March, about rough sets by some Polish people. It just works. To continue, something which I hadn't heard people mention here, which is something I discovered as a physicist. It's a very basic thing in mathematics. It's about boundaries. Now, we've all heard boundaries in connection with John Bradshaw, this whole thing about dysfunctional families. That's a very big on the New York Times bestseller list. It turns out boundaries have to do with changing dimensionality. And there's a famous thing which got Poincaré into topology called the Jordan curve theorem, 1871. It's about boundaries, which dimensions have boundaries and which don't. I presume boundaries are very important in architecture. Well, I remember in Indonesia seeing some incredible houses which seem to have no walls or anything. Perhaps the convener can leave top houses, the sort of Toraja houses have no walls or anything. Last comment, and please don't take this as a criticism. I wonder why there are no mathematicians here. I mean, maybe there are some. I just wanted to do this by accident because I happened to hear about Chuck Thing last night and just wanted to see what it was about. A lot of famous topologists and geometers around Boston.
It's your hometown.
Excuse me?
It's your hometown.
Oh, no, it isn't. I'm from San Francisco and Brooklyn.
Oh.
I was just curious why people didn't invite topologists and geometers, Raoul Bonner, Izzy Singer, or some of the greatest people in the world. It would be interesting to hear what they have to say about these ideas. And my last question is a question finally. Well, what connection was there between Bucky and Escher? I have nothing to say about that, so now I'll shut up. Does anyone have a comment about that?
Yes, Buckminster sent me 2 books about himself, one by Marx that was mentioned before. And I didn't know what else to send him in exchange. And incidentally, my 2 published books of those, one was a wave mechanics book. And I think you're wrong. I think that wave mechanics definitely allows continuity, but also very clearly illustrates the discrete quantum numbers, the whole numbers. So I think that's a very good illustration. But to get back to Escher, I sent Buckminster then a book by Escher on Escher's work, because I was friendly with Escher at the time, and he had never heard of Escher. He was very impressed. And in 1964, I organized a symposium at which I wanted to bring Buckminster and Escher together. They were both scheduled to be speakers, and then Escher became ill, and I had to read his paper. And so they never did meet. As a matter of fact, Ed, you may correct me, but I recall that at some time Buckminster was so enthusiastic that he wanted Escher to do some illustrations for synergetics.
Yes, I recall that.
And I wrote Escher, and he agreed. But then the synergetics book dragged out so that by the time it really went into production, Escher had died. So it was a very near meeting, but they never did meet, and it was a great pity because I saw a lot of both of them at the same time.
Not so much did they meet, did they know about or use each other's ideas in any way?
Well, yes, as I just say, Fuller had never heard of Escher until I sent him the book. Then got very fascinated and asked me if I would invite Escher to do illustrations for the book. And Escher knew about Fuller through Coxeter, because they both knew Coxeter very well. Yes, so those were the links.
Arthur, I'd just like to say something about a priori and a posteriori. Bucky never used the word a posteriori. He disdained academic jargon. And he didn't use a lot of words. He never used psychology. He used pronouns, you and me, and otherness, self and otherness. But he would never use psychology, and he didn't use a lot of academic terms. And he would have rejected a posteriori as a technical term, just familiar philosophers talking to each other. However, he did use the word a priori, but he used it with mystery. It was a great a priori mystery. So.
Well, I'll try and answer. I don't know whether I can, but I think in Bucky, all those levels that you just mentioned, they were all integrated. They were there without, I guess, really any kind of conscious separation on his part. He just naturally thought and projected, as he felt and as he thought. It's just that when I sort of began to prepare, or think about this symposium, that it seemed to me that at the sort of everyday level at which I operated in terms of being his architectural partner and working on projects, that with the projects that I did work on with him, I thought that there would come a quicker recognition of what he was doing and a sort of build-up and a momentum of the sort of thought and architectural sort of philosophy that he was trying to get understood. But the thing that I felt was that we seemed to hit a kind of a peak, and then it leveled off or just stayed there, and I didn't see the sort of cumulative sort of buildup of accreditation to Bucky for what he's been doing. There was the AIA gold medal, and there were other sort of honors given him, but it just didn't sustain itself and keep going. And so that's when I began to think about, well, where is Bucky's significance? And then the micro and macro sort of came to mind, and that's why I made that comment. But I think that in Bucky himself, this is all sort of integrated, and I don't know. Maybe it's not an answer, but maybe some of the other people here can comment on that.
I have a comment, if I may.
Yes.
In my terms, and I'm not an intellectual, I can't talk in these same terms as these learned gentlemen sitting next to me. But in Bucky refers to world citizenship so often. Not only world citizenship, but world man and cosmic citizen. And I take this as an allusion to that the individual is the microcosm of the macrocosm, put it that way, which is not the original thought. You find that in Hindu scriptures. Thou art that. What is it? Yeah. And you find that in the Christian, and you find that in philosophy and Socrates and know thyself and all this, and learn, to thine own self be true. And I think what he was saying was that we are the universal. The universal is us, and we have to recognize it. And that reverberated in me, that I can be a world citizen. I can claim to be world citizen, and that means I am the microcosm of the macrocosm, and that's why I continually relate world citizenship to world government. We are the world government, being the world citizen. So it's not an edict, it's not a centralized tyranny that people usually think of when they talk about world government. It's us, it's humanity, which is already a de facto world government. That's how I would read micro and macro.
Over the last couple of years, I've heard presentations by various people at both Harvard and MIT and other universities talk about Buckminster Fullerene as they make it. And I raised my hand at the end of the lecture and said, well, have you ever read Synergetics? And I've only found one. who's actually read Synergetics when they're doing work on Buckminster Fullerene, which is, I think, symptomatic of university structure and the kind of intellectual boxes that people put themselves in. One concept that I remember Buckminster Fuller writing about, which really sticks in my mind, is the concept of the bare maximum. And I wish that, you know, if people have any ideas about that or any recollections about how he came across that concept of the bare maximum as opposed to the bare minimum in trying to make all of humanity a success. Because I think it's an important concept to resurrect and to keep with us as we go into the future.
And I've certainly had an opportunity to observe that myself over the years. And the Buckminster Fullerene is something extraordinary that would be named after Bach. He didn't invent icosahedron, but nevertheless it's an expression of his prediction of the structure of the universe. And in my field of geology, his ideas have become apparent, or in a way proven, by the great advances of crystallography, for instance, in minerals. The basic structure being icosahedral, tetrahedral, and so on, symmetry of the atoms, whereas now we can see them with electron tunneling microscopes. This is just a faintest example. I will also say the Rocky Mountains, where I live, have now become dotted with little domes all over the place. People live in, some they decorate with shingles or black forest gables and things like that, a little bit odd. But anyway, the ideas have taken hold to some extent. And I wonder if you could comment on developments you've seen in general. People come and talk to me who've never met him, but nevertheless they've heard barely of his ideas and want some more explanations. And what have you seen individually other than what you've said already about his impact in the world of ideas?
Well, you mentioned Buckminster Fullerene. The scientists would never have discovered it without this exquisitely new recent developments. It's just the Nobel Prizes and everything have been given for people that have developed these exquisite new ways of measuring the spectrometry and spectrography. But it didn't predict the shape or the allocation of this at all. And so Buckminster Fullerene was discovered several times but not recognized. And it was only, as Arthur said, that you have the visual intuition of it was trying to register an icosahedron, but the chemists weren't used to thinking that way. And so when Smalley and Croteau named this Buckminster Fullerene for him, I went and called on them on behalf of the family and the estate and to express their gratification. But I said, you've done it for trivial reasons, because it could have been icosahedrine, it could have been saccharine, but you've done it for really trivial reasons. He says, well, you know, it's 20 words and there's 20 sides to an icosahedron, and it says so much and so little because Buckminster Fullerene is a long word to you. But in the chemical nomenclature, it takes up about 2 column inches. And I said, but you named Buckminster Fullerene for trivial reasons because it looks like his domes. But I said, what you don't really understand is that Bucky didn't develop his math to build domes. He built domes because people didn't understand his math.
Yes, and I think that we can go even further because Smalley apparently saw this molecule C60 and didn't know what to make of it, and then remembered that he had a dome kit for one of his children. And then he went to his dome kit and actually built the first model.
And both of them had visited the Montreal Dome when they were young men.
And they had the kit in the house and built overnight, the first molecular model of fullerene from a Fuller dome kit. So it was a very concrete connection, and a very legitimate name.
I have another, there's an apocryphal story that I've heard about a young 12-year-old who came to Bucky one day and said, Mr. Fuller, what one thing would you do to make the world work? And his answer was, unite the electric grids.
Yeah.
You remember this? And the 12-year-old says, well, what would that do? And so forth. And he says, well, Energy is universal. There's no lack of energy in the world. The sun is pouring billions of kilowatts per day. And if you unite the electric grids, then you're immediately able to use the sun's energy because energy travels at the speed of light. And the earth turns, and therefore you have a differential in need for energy, et cetera, et cetera. And when you have universal energy, you don't have to use the fossil fuels, which is our capital. You don't have to use nuclear. You protect the environment, and he went on and on. When you raise living standards, population goes down, and so forth and so on. And the application of that, obviously, is through this new organization called Genie, which has taken that idea and has talked to electrical engineers and unions all over the world now about this uniting of electric grids. The first thing that happened when the Berlin Wall came down was that the Eastern Germans and the Western Germans united their electric grids. Yeah, and technologically there's no problem. As he pointed out in his Dymaxion map, all the continents are linked except for the Bering Straits, which is only 35 miles. And just as an afterthought, when we went down to the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, I took this idea and I said, well, Bucky in his Critical Mass in the World Game chapter talked about a new kind of money, kilowatt dollars. He says if money is just energy, and if you're talking about world money, then you have to put it in kilowatts. So I went to a printing shop and I got some security paper and we printed 5,000 kilowatt dollars. I mean, this is a practical application of what Bucky's doing, of Bucky's thinking. And we just started distributing these in our stand at the Earth Summit. And it went like wildfire. Everybody was talking about, hey, get your world money at the World Government stand and so forth. I practically ran out of it. Anyway, we have some left. But that's a practical application of
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a very small one. Maybe I'd like you to stay in the microphone. Bucky may have gotten some of his ideas in a very unusual way. When I was a young Boy Scout, I was a mineral collector. I went to the New York Mineralogical Society. And of course you people know that Danish manual and system of mineralogy. But there's a strange old history about it. There's a French I guess an abbot, his name was Abbey, either Huay or Hauy, who seems to have discovered and classified most of the crystal Howie, something like 13th or 14th century. And I'm just wondering if Bucky ever was inspired by it, because I have a book of his.
I heard about it. It was around 1800, and I have a publication by Hoykas on this discovery. And the paper I'm just writing at the moment of the rational indices in crystals all went through the same sort of thing where you have the simple law, and then it was questioned also whether they weren't rounding off. It's a very interesting question.
Hi, since we're speaking in honor of Buckminster Fuller, I want to add some personal comments on how I met him. I used to be a structural engineer here in Cambridge, and remember speaking at the Boston Architectural Center when people ran around with headbands. And I later on took what I learned from him into my own life and found out it was very difficult to really follow that life. Number one, I was trying to cut down on excessive language, which is here someone stated here is not academic, usually attributed to academician using excessive language. Nevertheless, I was many times accused by other people that they wouldn't really know what I'm talking about. I was too academic, but I was not. So what, however, happened was I advocated with other people in the interest of using multimedia forms of communicating information. I was also stimulated by what came in at some point where Fuller propagated that people could potentially be in large auditoriums or sports arenas and could be following what he was actually talking about. A lot of times, in order to know what he's speaking about, we have to know his maximum map. And gentlemen on your right, expressed how important it was for him to have those. I have it since I started. I still have it on top of my working monitor in my studio. What I learned along the way was this. that in the time where he spoke and when he was alive, we were at a very critical stage in human development. We were actually in the Cold War, in the Cold War. And I think a lot of his effort and a lot of his work was discouraged. I personally have been discouraged from identifying myself with it through other member in advanced visual fields, as if the people that would think that way were mentally blocked. We were sort of belittled. Some people would want to refer to people as if Fuller was the guru or their guru, which I don't think was true either. However, because of the world military situation that we were living in, the proper development of architecture in the way how he encouraged it and the understanding of the language that he chose was not properly used, and it might just now be time to do so. I have little shape cubes, the tetrahedron that Buckminster usually would hold up in his hands, and I remember listening to him just because he was not referring to the regular grid system we had, he referred to a different grid system, seemed to give him additional power to speak and to be understood. But what I want to say is this: I came from a future conference at Tufts a few weeks ago and met an admiral from the Joint Chief of Staff, and he pointed out how just a few years ago the Cold War changed everything. And I think the time for Fuller's teachings to be understood might just about be starting now, because people that were around me advocating so-called solar energy or energy conservation or the approach of growing food or using wind, all of these other things were not in the interest of the military establishment, and they were basically discouraged. So I think they could have been, in a larger sense, a real mental block that didn't allow humanity to come together. But ultimately he said, if the future of the world depended on what you do and what you say, the future of the world would depend on you, what would you do, what would you say. And I think it depends largely on the individual to take on for himself what he can contribute. But here's one question I have about architecture. He proposed at some point that because of the potential that the Earth could go through changes, for example, and increased earthquake activity, he proposed certain shapes. He was actually even once proposing the tetrahedron shape for larger structures. And I know your office at some point had a similar looking shape almost. These projects were later then abandoned. Was there a limit in terms of size? Are these not doable, or was he totally wrong about larger shapes? I know many people just build smaller domes, but I was wondering about the tetrahedron shape as a larger structure.
One of the projects I can comment on is Triton City. Technically, it was just about feasible, but economically, it began to cost quite a bit. And I'm sorry, it's the other way around. That economically it was feasible, it made sense, but technically there was the question of when, in terms of hurricanes, how to anchor this large floating sort of 5,000 dwelling unit complex became a problem, and it did go through several sort of other evolutions and studies with the possibility of being used in Baltimore. They were thinking of anchoring a large structure there, but these were, I think, more in the realm of visionary and conceptual sort of things that we tried to advance by applying hard sort of, calculations and analyses, but just never got beyond that point to actually being realized.
You suggested that it was one of the inventions that had been abandoned. I don't think any of Fuller's inventions have ever been abandoned. They're merely lying fallow.
I just meant in terms of public dialogue, because when you look at architecture publications, everything looks as if that period never existed. It's shocking for me personally. So I turned my back against it and chose the video camera to have to communicate with things. I think he wanted to.
So you're and all of us who think that way experience the difficulties in marching to a different grid. Might be a good slogan to have.
That's both tense.
Yes.
Well, as a public service announcement, an all-day Indonesia, possibly some Malay event at Chinese Convention Center for free with architecture, food, and just all that culture. It should be very interesting if people have nothing to do. I got very addicted to Indonesia. And I went up to Malaya, but I wasn't there.
Very urgent questions. I would propose that we close the formal session and that any informal discussion be possible as long as our speakers are around. I do want to thank each of our speakers for a superb job, and it's been just very able, sharing your different views, comparing the views. So thank you, and I'd also like to thank the audience for having come here, for posing your questions, and for making this symposium so much of a success. And then again, thank you to Professor Anderson at MIT for your